Broadcasting from the world headquarters of the National Floor Safety Institute is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzie.
This is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzior. Thanks again for listening to my podcast. Today we're going to be joined by a Walkway Auditor who has been with us in the past, Mr. Brent Johnson with Traction Auditing. Brent was on this podcast prior talking about the role of a Walkway Auditor as employed by a business, by a company, maybe an insurance company, to take readings of floors, do an audit of a particular environment as to its safety and provide that information to a property owner. Well, much of what walkway auditors do is, well, on the flip side. Once a property owner is, somebody slipped and fell and files a lawsuit, walkway auditors, like Brent, are brought in to serve really the same purpose, just for a different reason. So welcome back, Brent.
Glad to be here.
Tell us about what happens when you get a call from an attorney saying, I need you to come out and help me on a case. How's that go?
Well, the first thing we do is try to get a little bit more detail from them, make sure that there's no conflict in the case, and then just a background of what happened, where it happened, what were the conditions when it happened, things of that nature, just to arm ourselves before we go out there. Many attorneys, that's all they want to give. They don't give a lot of details in the case to protect us in our objectivity.
Right. Why would an attorney hire you as a walkway auditor over, say, an expert witness, somebody who's an engineer or might have a training in engineering or something? But what's the motivation for attorneys to hire walkway auditors specifically?
The biggest thing is conflict of interest. If you hire an expert witness that's going to provide opinions in the case, it's going to very possibly come down to, well, of course they got those readings. That bolsters their case. In our case and situation, what we provide is objective information and objective evidence of what the coefficient of friction of that walkway surface is. And we do not offer opinions about it. Everything we do is tied back to national standards and the procedures in those national standards.
Now, you are a walkway auditor certificate holder. In fact, you're an instructor, a trainer.
Yes.
For the NFSI that wrote that program. And talk a little bit about that, the certification, the background, the training that a walkway auditor may need or should need in matters involving litigation.
Well, walkway auditors have a wider variety of education. I came from the safety background. We do walkway identification, types of floors, the proper flooring for a situation, how to clean a floor, how that works, be able to solve problems for people. When that comes into play in the litigation realm, then we've got a broader sense of knowledge than, say, an engineer that only looks at, was it the proper flooring or was there a failure in the flooring, things of that nature. And
although much of what you do is relatively simple, you have to use the right equipment. You have to have the understanding of the tribometers, the floor testing devices, the standards that you're going to be testing to. Talk a little bit about that. How do you go about knowing you're using the right device, you're referencing the right standards, and at the end of the day, when you ultimately produce a report, you're providing the relevant information that will benefit the attorney that retained you, and frankly, eventually a jury who may hear this.
Well, number one, you need to hire the right person. There are people that have all kinds of degrees that don't belong out there walkway auditing. For the simple fact that they're not familiar with that portion, but they feel like because they have a higher degree that they can do whatever they want. Look for somebody that is designated a walkway auditor. Number two, what equipment they use. There's equipment out there that does not measure coefficient of friction, but yet it's out there being used today. And many attorneys don't know the right questions to ask. So hence we do educational programs like this.
Wait, you mentioned they don't measure what do you mean? What do they measure?
They measure what is called the slip index, which has no relevance as far as coefficient of friction. Coefficient of friction is a scientific term, scientifically and mathematically measured, and so it's applicable. The standards that we use only use coefficient of friction.
Okay, well, why would somebody use a device that doesn't measure coefficient of friction? I mean, what would be
must be really good marketing. I can't answer that question other than the fact that they were in use before these standards came about, and people do not want to change.
So basically, it's the manufacturers of those devices that are marketing their equipment to experts or people to go out and take measurements of floors.
Right.
And so
now we only use NFSI approved devices. That means they've gone through an engineering study and passed, so that you know that a device that measures a static coefficient of friction of 0.5 is going to, the other device that's approved is still going to measure the same thing. That's the reason for that approval process. I would suggest using only people that have a WACH designation, for the simple fact that they've gone through the training, they know how to use the devices correctly. I've worked on cases and seen cases where you have guys that they're not WACH certified, and there's video of them helping the device along. We just can't do that. That influences the outcome. One thing I say when I teach my class is it's all about the integrity of the user. You've got to have integrity, and which we insist on with the WACH designation in order to get that. And so whether they're helping the device along or not using the correct standard, not putting the correct solutions on the floor, all of those go into improper usage.
So this Walkway Auditor, WACH or WACH designation, really is a minimum preparation to ensure that an attorney is bringing in someone that has that background, training, experience, knowledge to perform audits, to provide credible information, because at the end of the day, if an attorney hires someone that's not, it can really hurt their case.
Absolutely. We've been up against people that did not have that designation, and they were engineers, and they totally botched the measurement of the walkways, and it just made our case that much stronger.
Give me an example.
One guy, he came in, he tested out of an entire field of tile, tested one spot on one tile and said, these floors are dangerously slippery, when they were, in fact, moderate traction. And that he didn't go very far. He didn't last very long.
Yeah, well, understandably. Was that at the known location where somebody fell, or was it just
Yes.
kind of, okay.
Yeah, but you never know exactly where someone fell, exactly what tile. That's why you have to test a variety of tiles and a variety of sample sites around that, so that you get a general idea of what the coefficient of friction was in that entire area.
Because it may be different somewhere else?
It can be. I test, a lot of times I'll test 5 samples in and around where the slip and fall took place, and then go to an entirely different area to do additional tests to see if they've, in fact, done something to the tile right there.
Right. So that's an interesting point. So if you're going to be testing a floor, again, many times you're retained or brought in months or years after somebody fell. How is it when you test the floor and come up with a coefficient of friction value or range that you can somehow tie that into what happened 6 months, a year ago, maybe some cases multiple years ago? The person may have fallen 2 years ago. You test the floor today. Of what meaning does that data have? I mean, you can't really say it was the same today as it was then.
Well, I can't, but what you look at is the circumstances. Is it the same floor? Is it the same methodology for maintenance? We actually had this go to an appeals court, and the appeals court looked at it and said, because they have changed nothing on their floor, they've not changed their maintenance, they've not changed how and what they maintain the floor with, it is substantially similar. And it was upheld on appeal that the flooring was substantially similar, and therefore the walkway audit that we performed was legitimate,
scientific. Well, it's interesting. You could share a little bit about what that case was. Was there somebody was contesting, the other attorney of the other side was contesting your data, saying it was not valid?
Correct. I was working for the defense at the time. The plaintiff appealed and said that we were not scientific because it was 2 years after the fact, that our methodology was suspect, that our tribometer was suspect, and all of those things went into that and in the appeal. And the appeals court found, because it was substantially similar, that everything we did fell under scientific method.
So this has been tested by the courts?
Absolutely.
Wow. Now, you mentioned defendant. How much of your work is plaintiff versus defendant, does it?
We usually stay 55% plaintiff to 60% plaintiff and 45% to defense.
So you're seeing both sides?
I see both sides. I've been called by both sides and been actually hired by both sides on the same case, knowingly. I would never keep that from them, but they split the fee because they wanted to know. They knew there was a problem. They just want to know how big of a problem and how much that award was going to be.
Now, let's say you're testing a ceramic tile floor at a grocery store or restaurant, and you come up with a certain value of coefficient of friction, and say you're representing a plaintiff, and you find that the floor was slippery, low traction. But yet the defendant says, well, we've got data from the manufacturer of the ceramic tile that says, according to their methodology of testing, it was safe. I mean, they get confused with the numbers, all right? The coefficient of friction values numbers may be contested because, a certain manufacturer is saying, no, it was fine. That's confusing.
Absolutely.
How do you explain that to your clients?
Number one, you have to use the correct standard to test to. The manufacturers came out with a standard that is much easier to pass because they use half as much of surfactant in their wetting agent. That greatly influences the numbers.
That's the solution you put down prior to testing?
Correct. All of our testing is wet testing, and so the solution that we put down has a small amount of sodium lauryl sulfate in it, or soap, to break the surface tension. And they use half as much. And in our research, that greatly affects. It gives you an artificially high reading. So, and their research is just a single value, only for floors that are intended to be walked upon wet, and only one type of test. So they lose half of the testing and then give artificially high numbers. So as a result, we use the standards that are intended to be used on public and private walkways. And that's the ANSI B101.1 and ANSI B101.3. We tested both static and dynamic coefficient of friction to verify, because they measure two different characteristics of the floor.
And I know there's all kinds of standards produced by all kinds of organizations, including ANSI, which are the ones you're referring to, as well as ASTM. But not all standards are the same, and they're not all designed for the same purpose. The B101 standards are walkway safety standards.
Correct. They are safety standards, and that is the reason that we use them. The other standards are for quality control.
Okay.
And quality control is one thing, safety is another, and they literally say that in the beginning of their standard, that this is not a safety standard.
Yeah.
And so the actual manufacturer standard states that it is for quality control for uninstalled ceramic tile.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of architects. We did a podcast with Mark Edelman, a architect out of Chicago, and he mentioned how that's really brought a lot of confusion to their industry, that architects are specifying products that have a coefficient of friction provided by the manufacturers, but it's really not of the same meaning because they're really not a safety standard. The values apparently are easier to achieve. And so consumers sometimes are putting in floors that may not have the level of traction or slip resistance they thought, only to find out by way of a lawsuit when a Walkway Auditor comes out to test the floors that the floor was nowhere near what they thought it was.
We've been in a case like that. It was at a high-end casino, and they installed floors that they thought were at least moderate traction, and they were with half as much surfactant. However, when you use a safety standard to test them, they were extremely low. And as a result, a man slipped and fell and shattered his knee, which already had a knee replacement in it. And so here's a guy that's going to pay for that the rest of his life because of confusion wrought by conflicting standards. So,
let's go back a little bit for the benefit of our listeners. We've been using terms like high, moderate, low traction. What does that mean? There's a standard, the ANSI NFSI B101.3 or .1 standards, and there's 3 traction ranges. Explain a little bit about how that works. What meaning does that have?
Well, you have low, moderate, and high traction. Low, of course, is pretty self-explanatory. We speak like insurance companies in terms of risk, and that just elevates your risk to an unacceptable level of slips and falls. Moderate traction and high traction, those would be some slip-resistant floors. If it's a floor that's that's intended to be dry, then moderate traction's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. High traction is for floors that in a kitchen, in a bathroom, around a pool that are going to be possibly wet. Those are the floors you want to ensure to be high traction.
You mentioned insurance companies. Are they starting to do this? Are they hiring auditors? Are they testing floors? What's going on in your experience with insurers?
Well, there's 2 things that are going on with insurers. Yes, they're hiring auditors. The fraud is not a huge percent, but it's a large percent of payment, and so they want to know: do we pay this claim or do we fight this claim? And we can provide that objective information on that. Number 2. They are now starting to encourage their clients to do the audits, to perform audits and garner some types of discounts. We offer discounts to certain insurance companies that tell their clients, hey, you need to have this done. Because you are affiliated with us, they will give you a discount for that.
Oh, okay. Well, it sounds like progress is being made, huh?
Slowly but surely.
Now, when you're going to do an audit, a lot of people maybe are confused by the term audit versus inspection. You're doing more than just taking coefficient of friction readings. You're not just there, pushing a device around or using a device to come up with data. You're actually collecting more information, aren't you?
Correct. If we're doing a full-on audit, we do that for several companies. We go in, we look at everything from the coefficient of friction of the floors, of course, to how they clean their floors, what they clean their floors with, how they maintain, what the traffic patterns are, things that they can change to make things safer. All of those things go into an audit to give them the maximum amount of usable information.
So you're preparing a report that will contain a wide range of information, photographs, measurements, stuff like
Correct.
that?
It has floor plans. It has photographs. Every place that we've tested will be identified, and then we encourage them to do that on an annual basis so we can come back and see if they've made progress. We've got one large company that went from having multiple slips and falls a year on their terrazzo floor to having none. Just by following what the audit recommendations are. They changed what they waxed the floors with, the terrazzo. They changed what they cleaned their floors with and the methodology of it. And then they test once a year, and we've documented they went from a low, moderate traction to a high traction everywhere in the facility.
So when you're doing an audit for an insurance company or an end user, you mentioned casinos, that's a different process than when you're retained by an attorney, or is it the same?
Correct. Most attorneys, they don't need all that extra information. We'd be happy to pass it along to their customer or their client if requested. But all they want to know is, what was the coefficient of the floor? Did it comply with the national standards? And could it have been a possible cause of the slip and fall?
So let's play devil's advocate. You get hired by a plaintiff attorney and you do your testing and you find that the coefficient of friction is high traction. Or the opposite. You get hired by a defendant and you do the testing and say, this floor is very, very slippery. It's a low traction floor. You're giving them information as it is. How does that work with them?
Well, that's the beauty of being objective. We're an objective third party. And I know that we've been hired by some plaintiff attorneys that thought this was going to be the cherry on the cake, on the top. And it wasn't, because the floor, it wasn't actually the cause of the floor. It was the footwear or what they were doing at the time, running and jumping into a store. Well, guess what? You can't do that when it's raining outside and you've got flip-flops on. So because we are objective, we tell them, here's the information. It may or may not be what you were looking for, but this is true and correct information.
So when you prepare a report, you obviously, I guess, anticipate one day you're going to be deposed.
Absolutely. I have to be able to take that report back out of the file a year later, 2 years later, and look at it and be able to identify where I tested, what I tested, why I tested there, have pictures of it to identify it, have a floor plan, so that, because all of those things, as you know, go to deposition, and you got to bring them all and be able to identify them and speak intelligently and knowledgeably about those areas.
How about trials? Go to trial?
I've been to trial, and it's the same thing as a deposition. I speak to objective language, what I saw, what I tested, what the results were, and then when they say, well, Mr. Johnson, what if? I don't give what ifs. I give what was.
Right. You know, it's funny. Like
it's your job.
Yeah, that's right. In our work as trainers for NFSI, we both share the same opinion, which is, hey, if you're going to go out and get involved in litigation, doing testing of floors, preparing reports, providing information to an attorney regarding litigation, just make sure you're doing it the right way, because you never know who might be on the other side doing the same thing, meaning me or you,
yeah.
Brent. Hey, so if you're going to produce a report, you're going to get involved in litigation, understand that the other side might bring in somebody else who shares your level of experience and training and may come up with different results. You never know, but just do it right. That's the key, is, don't become a biased participant in the case. Remain a third-party independent source of information. That's what attorneys really want. Just kind of give us the truth here. Don't tell us what we want to hear, because that doesn't necessarily help. We're many individuals that have not gone through the WACH or Walkway Auditor certificate holder program don't quite get that.
No, they don't. They a lot of times are what we would call a shill for the one side or the other. They'll tell you whatever you want to know.
Yeah.
And that's when I speak to the classes that we teach. One of the things that I've expressed is the reason we started all this was to elevate the professionalism of what we do, because as you and I both know, the expert witness industry may not have the best name out there because of people like that. And unfortunately, they're out there. You get a guy that thinks he's all that, and he'll give you a 27-page report that's about 1 or 2 pages that actually says what you need, has the information and relevance that you need. And so I tell them, don't try to tell them and show them how smart you are. That's one of the beauties of our report, is it is precise, it's concise, and it tells them exactly what they need to know in language that they can understand. One of the greatest compliments I've gotten from attorneys is, man, I can understand this. Because that's my job, is to make them understand it.
Well, that's right. I mean, these cases generally are not complex. Don't make them complex. And coefficient of friction is a big term that the average person doesn't have a clue what that means. It's a decimal, it's a fraction. People get really lost with decimals. And so you got to take a scientific process, a method, test method, standards, and make it understandable to a juror who ultimately makes the decision whether or not the floor was in compliance or not. You mentioned a moment ago, and I want to go back to it, these testing devices, these tribometers. And there's seems to be, at least in my experience, kind of a boutique industry where certain manufacturers of equipment, at least in the past, have kind of created this market for expert witnesses. Hey, buy my device, take my class, and you too can be, a part of this exciting high-growth area of walkway auditing and become an expert witness. Is that something that you see a lot of or are familiar with?
Well, I am familiar with it. Unfortunately, they're a small percentage. Now, the devices we were talking about that measure slip index, those have been around for a long time, since the early 90s. And so they've got a running start on their marketing, things of that nature. And the thing about it is most people, even people that use their devices, will interchange slip index and coefficient of friction. And that's unfortunate. For me as an expert or as a walkway auditor, when I see that and I see their report interchanging slip index and coefficient of friction, sure makes for an easy case.
Well, I know there's standards, the ANSI, NFSI, B101.1 and .3 standards for measuring coefficient of friction and associating coefficient of friction with a particular traction level, high, moderate, and low traction. Are there any standards for this slip index?
No, they're not. No standards and no way to correlate one to the other.
So if somebody's going to act as an expert witness or take tests of floors and say slip index, I come up with a number and that value, that coefficient of friction, slip index value has a particular meaning. There's really no independent standard, credible standard to
none
support
at all.
that?
None to support the slip index. All of it is scientific method using coefficient of friction.
So as far as these devices go, you mentioned you use NFSI approved devices. Have you seen a difference in that, in types of equipment, specific devices that might provide more reliable, credible information, data?
Let me explain. The NFSI approved indicates that device has undergone a very rigorous independent laboratory study where they take independent labs and they have to do the testing with the device and come up with relatively the same numbers from independent lab to independent lab. And that documents the fact that device A and device B read the same. That has never been the case before, and we have people that are still squawking, oh, you can't use this one or this one because they don't read the same. We have taken care of that at the NFSI with the independent laboratory study, engineering study that is required of devices that want to be approved.
I've noticed in my work that few, if any, manufacturers of floors actually use these NFSI-approved devices. Instead, they use knockoffs or a particular device that, although is similar, is actually not the same as a NFSI-approved device. There's two portable devices, the TrackScan and the GS1.
Correct.
And I assume you use both of those?
I've used both, yes.
In your litigation work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Both of them, we have never been denied.
So if somebody came along and says, well, I used another device, it's not NFSI approved, and I came up with readings and the readings were different. How do you when an attorney says, well, help me understand why your numbers are different than somebody using a different device?
Well, the other devices, you don't know how they're manufactured. They have not undergone any independent studies to verify that they're even reading correctly. They may read higher, they may read lower, they may read all over the board, which is the experience that I've had coming up against them in a court of law. They're not real consistent and real precise in their measurements. They may be reading precise, but they're precisely wrong, and it demonstrates that in their variations
Yeah.
of their readings.
Yeah, they're giving the same number over and over, but it's the wrong value.
Yeah,
The value is misleading.
wrong value. They many times they use inferior parts to manufacture them, whereas the ones that have undergone the approval process, you don't get that kind of accuracy and precision using cheap stuff.
Now, we're not talking about the, back in the day when you had a block of wood and a chain and you pull it across the floor and it gives a little dial indicator you got to kind of read. I mean, these devices you're mentioning are very sophisticated, robotic, right? All electronic. They measure to 2 or 3 significant decimal points. So we're talking, there's really been some major advances in the technology just within the last 5 or 10 years where this equipment has become very sophisticated, unlike older equipment, which, just a little bit more difficult to use.
We've come from the block of wood or the elevator weight and the catfish scale, which was the ASTM C1028, which is long gone, to computerized. That computer can read and assimilate way better than we can. Can you still do coefficient of friction, pulling that weight with the scale? Yes, but not nearly as accurately.
Right.
And so we take the guesswork out of it. We take the influence out of it by letting the device do it. Can you still influence it? Sure, but you got to be wanting to do something wrong.
Right, you got to go out of your way to influence it.
Correct.
Where in the past you could influence it and not even know it.
And not have a clue that you're influencing.
Yeah, you didn't know that.
You've got one person that pulls it very quickly, one person pulls it very gradually. You're going to get 2 radically different numbers.
Have you found, just in your work, that this is you're getting more and more lawsuits, getting more retentions by attorneys? You see an increase in that, or?
Somewhat. What I'm seeing is an increase of being hired by the insurance companies to be sure that, hey, we either need to pay this claim or we need to fight it. They don't want to fight something and put a bunch of money into it that in the end they're not going to win. So
Right.
if they can settle that claim immediately because it needs to be, then they will do so. Otherwise, hey, these floors, there's nothing wrong with them. They're great. Okay, we'll fight that one.
How about the big guys, the big retail chains? You see any work from them? Is any the major industries that are affected by slips and falls, are they, to your knowledge, bringing in, hiring walkway auditors, independent guys like yourself? Are they doing testing? Are they testing their floors?
A few are. Unfortunately, most of them, that's what we got insurance for.
Yeah.
That's what you see. We'll raise the price of bananas 2%.
Right.
To pay for it. They don't want to know because there's some grocery store chains literally, they don't want to know. They don't document anything because if we document something, then that means if somebody slipped and fell, and then we have constructive knowledge.
Yeah.
And if and they think that they can just stick their head in the sand and it's not going to affect them. What they don't realize is they're the easiest ones to go after.
Yeah. Well, I've seen the same thing where a large retail chain will basically have a business strategy of, we don't want to test our floors because they may tell us we have a problem, and if we have a problem, we have to do something about it, and doing something about it means spending money, and we just don't want to put any money into solving the problem, so let's pretend it's not a problem. We don't know anything about the problem because we never tested our floors, and when somebody slips and falls and gets hurt, they kind of play dumb. That's the first time that's ever happened to us, even though it's a chronic event. And without beating up any particular company, but this is the single biggest form of claim that the retail grocery store industry has. I mean, you mentioned casinos, healthcare. We can go down the list of industries that this is the number one form of injury, and it would seem that much of them can be prevented by simply being proactive, bringing in an auditor, getting some data, providing some insight, take corrective action. It may not solve the problem entirely, but it certainly, as you illustrated, could make a big difference. And so, why is it, Brent, that folks just, maybe they just don't want to test?
Well, part of that is whose pocket is it coming out of? I know several people, they would love to to do walkway auditing and cure the problem that they have. Unfortunately for them, the cost of the slip and fall comes out of their budget, but the cost of the maintenance comes out of somebody else's budget. So in order to change how they're doing it or what they're doing it with or the chemical that they're using, that takes money and it takes time. And if it doesn't work, then somebody's on the hook for it. And so because it comes out of their budget, they say, oh, well, we're going to stick with what we've got. And the other guy that the slip and fall comes out of his budget is left hanging. I've seen that time and time again, that budgets play a big role in it and trying to make themselves look good on their budget.
Have you ever, just out of curiosity, approached, a retail chain and you come out and do some testing for you? And I mean, what do they say to you? No?
Oh, we've literally offered it for free. For free. First, we thought, okay, well, it was a rather large chain. We'll do it for $500 per store. Then we said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll do it for nothing. They still said, no, thank you. Why? Because they don't want to know, because if you know, you got to do something about it. The unfortunate part is a slip and fall may, if it goes to trial, cost them $100,000 plus.
Yeah.
They could remedy everything for way less than the cost of one slip and fall.
Sad, but welcome to America, where, like you said, and I agree, it's whoever's paying for it. And so if somebody falls, they have a large insurance claim, it's an insurance company picking it up. Whatever's remaining that maybe an insurer won't pick up, they simply pass that cost along to their customers. And that's Absolutely. The business model. I mean, so they accept falls, they accept injuries, they accept the costs associated with them. It's simply part of their business model. And sadly, those companies, I guess, are going to see on the back end when you're hired by an attorney.
That is what we try to tell them on the front end. Do it ahead of time. There's a problem, and some are nervous. Well, what if you find out there's a problem? That's not a problem. You proactively went out, sought help, got help, cured the problem. There is no constructive notice now because you've done your due diligence. You went out, you sought independent. You sought out an independent opinion, and you cured the problem. So now, you're never going to eliminate slips and falls, but suddenly you have said, okay, we've done everything we can do to prevent them. And so, in my experience, when the numbers are in your favor, plaintiff attorneys don't even want to take the case because they only want cases they can win.
Yeah. So with that, any advice to attorneys that are involved in personal injury cases, both plaintiff and defense attorneys? Any advice to them about the role of or importance of auditing?
Well, the importance of auditing is, number one, be careful who you hire, because you can hire people, they'll give you all kinds of reports that are pages and pages and pages long that say absolutely nothing that affects your case because they have not been trained in walkway auditing. So hire a walkway auditing certificate holder. That goes a long ways because that's what they're absolutely trained for. Hire an engineer if there's a floor failure. That's great. But as far as testing the floor, you hire somebody that knows the standards, knows the methodology, and does it correctly. And that's plaintiff and defense. Either one. Hire somebody that's independent, that's not going to give you their opinion, but they're going to give you their objective information.
Wow, good advice. We've been speaking with Brent Johnson from Traction Auditing, and I want to thank you for coming back today.
My pleasure. We're here to educate people and let them know the best way to go about.
Well, how would somebody go ahead and get in touch with you if they want to talk to you?
Well, they can go to our website, www.tractionauditing.com. They can email me direct at brent.johnson@tractionauditing.com or call our number, and we will be there. And you may not hire us, but we're going to give you the information that you need one way or the other.
Good. Well, thanks again, Brent. This has been America's Slip and Fall Guy, Russ Kenzior. Thank you again for listening to my podcast. Remember, make sure you make your next step a safe step. Take care.